Wherever you're listening in the world, thank you for tuning into this special episode of IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, and following the savage attack on Israel on Shabbat, October 7th, 2023, we're bringing you another conversation on the war. But before we bring on our guest, I do want to say that Israel's needs right now are absolutely astronomical. Peoples whose homes and communities were destroyed require all the basics you can imagine. JNF USA is on the ground in Israel doing absolutely phenomenal work, and I urge each and every one of you to give, whether it's $1 or $1 million, just give. Do go to jnf.org/support Israel. Once again, jnf.org/support Israel. JNF is doing just phenomenal work there, as I said. Now, as for our guest, we are truly honored to welcome Ruth Wasserman Lande to the program. Now, Ruth is a former member of Knesset and founder and co-chair of the Knesset Caucus for the promotion of the Abraham Accords. Now, in that capacity, she is currently a board member in the official Israeli Gulf Chamber of Commerce. She also served as Deputy Director General for International Affairs in the Federation of All Local Governments in Israel, and as an advisor to President Shimon Peres for Foreign and Jewish Affairs. Now, as a career diplomat in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, she served for 3 years as Deputy Ambassador in Israel's embassy in Cairo. She has a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post and the Hebrew Daily Ma'ariv, and is a regular commentator on all news channels. We've seen her all over the place. She is currently the founder and CEO of Ruth Global Strategic Consulting. And with that, Ruth, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to welcome you to this episode of IsraelCast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
All right. Well, there's so much to talk about, and I really want to start out by framing the conversation. And the best place to do that is really to talk about Iran. So can you share with our listeners really how Iran is behind all of this, and I mean the war, and how Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah are all the tools of this puppeteer that we call Iran?
Okay, well, that's easy enough because Iran is the mastermind of all of this horrific war. People tend to look at it as the Israel-Gaza war, but this is a completely wrong prism via which to watch, analyze, and look at this particular conflict/war. Iran is standing behind this particular event beginning on October 7th. But let me take a few steps back and explain that Iran had meticulously and patiently, I must add, planned its incursion and infiltration into first Lebanon with Hezbollah, plus with Hamas, a less known fact. But let's remind everybody that Lebanon is a failed state, and that is the conducive ground upon which Iran actually forwards its own imperialistic interests, its interest of becoming the hegemon, not only in the region, but widely a hegemon, and so on. So it has entrenched its own operatives in the form of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's also very much present in Syria, another failed state, again, conducive for its own interests, and has advisors and technology and weapons and know-how on the Syrian soil. Third, of course, as we know and as we see now, the Hamas is being funded and trained in Gaza by Iran. There's no question about it, even though Iran is Shiite. And of course, the Arabs, as they call them, or the Palestinians, this time Hamas, are Sunnis. But Iran is using the Hamas as a pawn and the Palestinian people in general. And that is yet another proxy in the south of Israel. Then we have the West Bank. In the West Bank, we have yet more Hamas operatives funded, trained, and placed there, particularly by Iran. Not only the Hamas, but also the Islamic Jihad. And over and above all of that, there is a continuous attempt by Iran to nudge and try and get them to cooperate, and that is the Israeli Arabs. Those Arabs that hold Israeli passports, that may be prone to get encouraged or incited by propaganda and ideology promoted by Iran. And there have actually been Sunni sheikhs that have come out, not publicly, but in the internal Arab-Israeli arena, saying this is a really bad thing because, this is a Shiite influence on Sunni Israeli Arabs. It's not caught on so much, but it does exist, and nobody speaks about it. Over and above all of that, the Houthis in Yemen are funded, trained, and basically held by Iran, causing a lot of discomfort to countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on. Plus, we know that they have their own Shiite forces in Iraq, currently causing a lot of discomfort to the United States and their own interests in Iraq. Basically, Iran had conscientiously worked for years not to promote the well-being of its own people, not to promote the well-being of Palestinians in any way, but to promote its own imperialistic interests and to use the Arabs upon which they look down. And this is a very important thing to understand in order to have their own interests promoted in the region.
And can you talk exactly what is their interest? Because, they call the US the great Satan and Israel is the little Satan. Israel is really on the front lines of all of this before everybody else in the West. So if you can dimensionalize that for our listeners.
So first of all, their ideology says that Israel needs to be wiped out. This is not something that I'm making up. They say it out openly. They are attempting for a number of years to gain nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and they say that their intention very clearly, unapologetically, is to destroy the land of Israel, the Zionist entity, as they call it, and to save Al-Aqsa. Never mind Al-Aqsa, nothing has happened to Al-Aqsa, definitely not surrounding this event of October 7th, but this is a wonderful way in which to galvanize support amidst Muslims throughout the world and, of course, the Arabs in the region. What is the interest of Iran? To become a significant regional and more than regional power with the help of a certain axis of countries such as Russia, China, Qatar. Apparently now Turkey as well has joined this axis or is making sounds as if it's wanting to join the axis. But I must say that there's always been competition between Turkey and Iran, and we'll need to see because both of them want to be that hegemon that Iran is seeking to be. But certainly there is a challenge to the current world order led by the US. This is the interest of Iran. And all of the proxies that it uses are being used as pawns because they are Arabs. They're what you call the kind of human power that can be sent to the front line rather than Iranians, rather than their own people, in order to die if necessary or to perform whatever it is that Iran needs them to do. I'd just like to say that this is not all of the Iranian people, God forbid, but rather the mullah leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
When I was in Iran, I was there in 2007, and I kept hearing from average people that some people said 70% don't support the government. Some said 80% don't support the government. And I happened to have been there on what's known as Death to America Day, the anniversary when the Iranians took over our embassy. And I remember meeting one school teacher, and because everyone was going out to protest, and she said, "We all say death to America, but we don't mean it." And so, again, there is a distinction between the mullahs who are running the show and the average Iranian person who disagrees with that. And I want to get to the level of support that, say, for example, the Palestinians have for Hamas, for Hezbollah, for Fatah in just a second. But what do you do about Iran then? I mean, how do you solve all of this?
First of all, it's a very difficult question. Let's begin with the fact that we need the world to comprehend, or the Western world to comprehend, that one, this is not an Israel-Hamas skirmish or conflict or fight, nor is it an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We are talking about, yes, there are issues between Israel and the Palestinians, certainly not the land of Gaza. This is an uninteresting issue for Israel, and had the Hamas not thrown rockets over civilian population, not to mention the heinous deeds that were perpetrated on October 7th, this war would not be happening. This just would not be happening. In fact, on the weekend prior to the horrendous Black Shabbat, as we call it, the murders and the rapes and the massacre, etc., the government of Israel was discussing allowing more Palestinian workers from Gaza to get permits to come into Israel. This is how far away the government of Israel was from beginning a war with Hamas in Gaza. But just to go back to your question, we are talking about having the world comprehend that this war is not an Israeli-Hamas war. This is a challenge of a certain axis of countries towards and against the United States of America leading a different axis, including countries like the European, Western countries, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on. So that is the first underlying need or condition in order to answer your question of what is it that needs to be done about Iran. When we understand that, we can absolutely understand that sanctions need to be extremely strong and unrelenting towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that there can be no negotiation with these kinds of forces, whether it's the Hezbollah, which has already been pronounced as a terrorist organization, but also Hamas, which has not been declared by everyone as a terrorist organization, and Iran and its other proxies. The third issue is we need to create an international coalition, because this is not just Israel's fight. Yes, Israel will protect its citizens, will do what is necessary to make sure that nothing like this nightmare will ever happen again. And it is doing what it can and will continue. But we all are thinking, especially the United States administration, about the day after. Because once we make away with Hamas, which is a very big sentence to say, there are approximately 40,000 Hamas armed operatives. But what happens to the ideology that has become almost inherent and embedded in a huge population, some of which may be innocent and civilian and unwilling to partake in horrific deeds, but the incitement and the horrors that are being fed to the next generation, the incitement is, there are no words to describe, there are no limits to this incitement in the school books, in the curriculum, in the newspapers, in the rhetoric, in the ideology. And this needs to be uprooted. If this is not uprooted, nothing makes sense, because this is not going away. You cannot expect to feed 20 years a child with horror images of what is Israel and the Jews throughout the world, by the way, not to mention other infidels and non-believers in the Muslim faith, and then to expect them not to become terrorists and kill Israelis, and others. So this needs to be uprooted, and there are very clear ways in which to do that. One, to understand that UNRWA, a UN agency funded by the UN, is the one that has the authority and the responsibility to supervise the syllabus and the curriculum in the Palestinian Authority too, not only in the Gaza Strip. And in the Palestinian Authority and the Gaza Strip together, they have huge incitement. This needs to stop. In other words, the funding from the European Union, which has already been frozen for that for 2024, following October 7th, and they said clearly this is because of the incitement in the school books, and the US help and donations by USAID and others to UNRWA in order to take care of the population. They don't take care of the population. They brainwash the population.
Why did it take the European Union, I mean, I suspect I know, but I'd like to hear from you, so long to freeze the funds? I mean, it took this to freeze it, but they certainly knew what were in the textbooks and what was being taught in class.
You know, it's very difficult for me to answer that question. I think it's a question that needs to be addressed to the European Union. There seems to be a degree of naivete in the West, which has allowed the US current administration, and I have zero political affiliations to do with the United States. We have over and above what we can handle in Israel. The $6 billion to make them available to the Iranians. Thank God this was frozen as well, just in time. But there has been talk of renewing the agreement. There has been a continuous concern about human rights and not hurting civilians, which I completely side with and agree as somebody who comes from the liberal frame of mind and the liberal center party, the blue and white party politically in Israel. But we need to understand that we're dealing with a force which is very, very evil. It's not a movie. Sounds like a movie, but it's not. And this force, apart from beheading, raping, gang raping, massacring, burning people alive, perpetrating horrors which are beyond. I mean, for Israelis, this is another Holocaust. Yeah. But beyond that, they have been infiltrating themselves meticulously as a roadmap in Europe and in the United States, in Canada and in Australia. These are all Western democracies, and one can just take a look and see what is going on in these countries. What are these crazy demonstrations pro-Hamas after perpetrating these horrors in London and in other places? This is not a force to be naive about. This is something that needs very quick, eye-opening measures to deal with. Otherwise, it's going to simply eat us all alive. And I'm talking about the United States as well.
Let's talk about the protests then, because these are a bunch of useful idiots, let's use the term. And I think to myself, they are so-called, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here, liberals, and they're trying to take their own values and apply it to values of people that are diametrically opposed to any sort of liberal value. And I'm just wondering if you can weigh in on that and what your message is for all of these useful idiots.
You know what? I'm a very, I won't call anybody a useful idiot. I'm you know what? I'm calling very humbly to the Western world. Wake up. Wake up. This is already in your backyard. There are zillions of examples. You know, the Hamas shot Fatah operatives in the kneecaps in 2005 when they took over the Gaza Strip. The IDF left the Gaza Strip. There were free elections. The people voted for Hamas, and then the Hamas operatives threw Fatah operatives. Fatah are also Palestinians, for those who are not 100% with us, from the windows. They lynched them. These are the Palestinians belonging to Abu Mazen and Arafat, those that currently hold the reins in the West Bank. So to expect anything different in the West Bank in the day after Abu Mazen is silly. It's not going to happen. And Iran made sure that it's not going to happen because they have prepared the West Bank with enough Hamas operatives and Islamic Jihad operatives to take over. And that's what they intend to do in the West Bank as well. My call for the Western world is wake up. It's in Europe. There are cells everywhere. The images that we see these days with the demonstrations, they are not anti-Israeli, as they declaratively say. They are anti every single value that you hold dear. They are completely against homosexuals, lesbians. They will not allow that at all. Again, I stress, they lynched their own people, because they disagreed with them politically. The Islamic oriented Hamas and Islamic Jihad, this is a religious, it's not even a party. It's a religious movement like the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. Whereas the Fatah, they are simply secular. They are more land-oriented, more nationalistic. They lynch their own people, the Hamas. Why would anybody in their right mind believe that they wouldn't lynch non-believers, non-Muslims?
How do we get that sentiment changed, though, Ruth, amongst all those protesters here? And I'm not talking about the cells from Hamas that are already in the United States and in the Western world. And by the way, I mean, our southern border is wide open for business, and God knows who's come across that border, which is a whole other subject. But how do you begin to change the minds of these students, for example, that have been totally brainwashed at very elite universities?
So first of all, there are many measures to be taken, but again, it all depends on the change of mindset of Western leaders. And it's beyond me how they could possibly not do that, particularly with everything that's happening now. First of all, the open border that your country has with Mexico is not a completely different issue. It's exactly the same issue because through that border, not only illegal work seekers come, but also potential terrorists. And I am certain, beyond doubt, that again, part of the meticulous planning of infringement and infiltration into the Western democracies is done via that border. I think that there was an understanding now by the current administration and that a barrier is being built despite the fact that in the beginning the policy was against it. But another thing that could be done, because now some of them had already entered, is the much more significant law enforcement and supervision and legislation regarding what is happening vis-a-vis buying public opinion. You mentioned the college campuses. A lot of these colleges receive tons of money from Qatar. Qatar should not be allowed to donate money to American or European college campuses. This is an issue for legislation. It's doable. They buy public opinion, and this is what drives the actual, I would say, hordes of young people, impressionable young people, to get loads of disinformation. One need only look at Al Jazeera, 100% owned by Qatar. Al Jazeera lies all the time, all the time.
But just going back to our southern border, as you know, there have been people that are on the terror watch list that have been nabbed, but we don't know of all the gotaways. And these aren't Mexicans and people from Guatemala and Honduras. These are people from North Africa, the Middle East. We've also had Chinese, for example, and we know Venezuela's relationship with Iran as well. And we've had plenty of Venezuelans come through our southern border as well. This is a very, very serious issue, even here in the United States. I think gradually people are waking up to it, but it's a little bit too late, too little, too late, as we say here in the United States. So Ruth, yes, you wanted to say something.
I wanted to add, we need to speak out on CNN, on all of the major news outlets. I particularly mentioned one that is more left-leaning because we need to really raise awareness amidst the vast majority of the public in Europe and in the United States, in Australia, and in Canada. Second, we need to speak to all of the lawmakers, all of the legislators. We need to make law enforcement vis-a-vis the infiltration of these forces and funding much more difficult. This is something that needs to be taken care of. Otherwise, we'll be facing a huge problem that we cannot solve.
I agree with you, yet it's a question of booking people on these various networks. We had Colonel Richard Kemp here on the program, and he said, and he's, you know, his background, and he said he can't get on Sky News to talk about Israel. And he was told, and he mentions it in the episode, by a very senior reporter that they won't have him on, but they agree with him. And they'll have him talk about other issues. But here is Colonel Richard Kemp, and they don't allow him to talk about Israel. So the onus is also on the editorial staff as well. And that's a huge, huge issue. But I think every little trickle, every little drop that we make is a win, if you will. And then hopefully the floodgates will open. So I want to go back to the Palestinian people's sentiment. Can you address to what extent really the people of Gaza support Hamas?
So first of all, there are people in Gaza who hate the Hamas. They can't say it because they'll be shot. Many young people were shot. There is a huge population in Gaza with walking sticks because they've been shot in their legs. A huge number of young people. There are many issues in Gaza, for example, like a lot of drug consumption and depression and so on. And there is a lot of poverty. But the poverty is in the majority of the population, whilst the Hamas and the leadership they have everything that they need. You know, very often, Stephen, the world media blames Israel for not giving enough water to the Palestinians. And this is crazy because, you know, it's beyond me. The Israelis are in charge of 11% of the water that goes to Gaza. 89% of the water is in the hands of the Hamas. Why is the world not asking Hamas, why are you not giving your people water? They have water. The leaders underground, they have water. Believe me, they have a whole city underground, an entire underground city. By the way, their headquarters is where? Under the Shifa hospital in Gaza City, because they know the Jewish spirit. They know that Israelis are moral. They will not bombard a hospital, which is insane because they are all under that particular hospital. Now, they have the water, they have the gas, they have the food, they have everything that they need. The leaders of Hamas, the actual leaders of Hamas, are all in Qatar, in beautiful, lush hotels. this is a completely different story to the people in the Gaza Strip that live relatively difficult lives unless they are part of the Hamas. The same story in the West Bank. We are now not talking of the West Bank, but the vast majority of people in the West Bank, even though the situation there is very different, are also fed by the same very insightful propaganda and syllabus. They haven't changed one single word as opposed to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. Plus, there is a huge level of corruption where Abu Mazen has a house that looks like an absolute mansion, looking more like Putin's mansion than anybody else's. And the people close to Abu Mazen and the Fatah get the jobs and the best assets, whereas the majority of the people have issues with employment, with income, and so on. This is something that perhaps gives us a hint as to whether there are, in fact, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip that dislike the Hamas leadership. But I dare say, Stephen, having said all of that, that a lot of the people have been indoctrinated for so long with Israel hatred, with antagonism, plus, you know, the retaliation of the Israeli IDF. It's not an easy thing to live with. The Hamas uses its people as human shields. With all of the billions that it received from the European Union, from Qatar, from elsewhere, they haven't built shelters for the people. That's why if there are bombardments and people are being bombarded, they die and they get hurt and they get impacted by the bombardments. Second, the IDF is the only military in the universe which in Arabic sends pamphlets and literally calls the people, leave the building, leave, we don't want to hurt you, we have no interest in it, we want to bombard this particular place because we have information that the Hamas is using it for something. What is the Hamas doing? It is shooting, executing people that would not stay to be serving the Hamas as you. It is crazy to believe. It's so extreme that it sounds like science fiction, but this is what is happening. It's even difficult to imagine, to convey to the Western world because we cannot fathom such evil. The Hamas is preventing masses of people from leaving the northern part, even though the IDF promised and is fulfilling the promise with Egypt and the United States to provide food, water, and medicine for those who fled to the south of the Gaza Strip. 250,000 more or less Palestinians remain in the northern part, and the Hamas will not let them leave. Do they support the Hamas? Do they want to be free of the Hamas? I would imagine that some of them want to be free of the Hamas. But are all of them not supporting Hamas and innocent civilians? Unfortunately, and despite the tragedy of the entire war and the fact that people are dying on the Palestinian side too, my answer is no. There are many people who detest Israel, detest Jews, are fed with complete disinformation and vile incitement for years and years. And we could see it when the Hamas operatives came back to Gaza after the carnage with civilian hostages, some of them babies, some of them grandmothers. They were received by candy and celebrations by a mass of people. Who are these people? They were civilians.
I want to pivot for a moment, Ruth. And if you can talk about Arab leaders publicly saying one thing and privately saying another vis-a-vis Hamas's activities?
So it's very clear to me, I'm an Arabist, and my expertise specifically is Egypt, in particular, but the Arab world in general. If anybody understands what is Hamas, it's Egypt. They declaratively are very pro-Palestinian. They want to provide humanitarian aid, and they do. They allow from the Rafah crossing to have trucks full of medicine and water and food being sent to the southern part of Gaza after being checked by the Israeli IDF. They're also building a field hospital for the Palestinians on the Rafah border, but on the Gazan side, make no mistake, so that nobody from Gaza will cross, not one Gazan, one, will cross into Sinai, because they know what are the Gazan people. They know what is the potential of infiltration from the Hamas. They know. They had the Muslim Brothers. They are not prepared, and I can understand them, to import this problem, this security issue into their own territory. They understand why the Hamas is a horrific organization and movement. The Jordanian king as well, but he married a Palestinian queen. She said what she says. There are a huge percentage of Palestinians in Jordan. The Hashemite kingdom is relatively weak in terms of its force. Iranians have succeeded in infiltrating Jordan as well. They've suddenly found religious Shiite sites, they remember, that exist in Jordan. They've done that in Lebanon, they've done that in Syria. They did that in the West Bank, and they do it in Jordan as well. They tried to infiltrate Egypt, but the Egyptians were having absolutely none of that. They are very firm and very strong, and they just kicked them out. But now that there is a Houthi hit on Taba 2 days ago, this is even more compromising for Egypt, because everybody knows who's behind the Houthis. And the whole issue of understanding on the level of the leadership, because they have the intelligence and they know what is the Muslim Brotherhood, what is the Islamic Jihad, what is Hamas. This whole issue is, mutual to Egypt, to the Jordanian king, to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, etc. The public, however, was not yet prepared mentally, ideologically, in terms of imaging, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of messaging, for the fact that they don't really represent the Palestinian people. They don't care about the Palestinian people. They use them as human shields. They don't provide shelters for them. They use the money not for employment opportunities, but to build tunnels and to prepare their own goals, which are militaristic against Israel and not for the benefit of the people. So the public doesn't know that enough. They are fed and nurtured by Al Jazeera, which, by the way, Egypt as a country had huge issues with, because they publicly and again criticized the leadership of Egypt until Egypt kicked them out, knowing that it's Qatar. Then they let them back in on the condition that they won't criticize the Egyptian leadership. What they didn't do is explain that the conditions also prevail to explaining what really is going on in the Arab world. And this was not done. The public in the Arab countries is not knowledgeable enough and did not receive the right information, the right syllabuses, the right messaging to really understand what is going on. So whereas the leaderships understand, the public doesn't. Again, I'm generalizing, of course.
And is it also not a question that they're using the Palestinians as a foil, if you will, to deflect from their own issues in their countries?
You know, I would perhaps say that this is not the case for the United Arab Emirates, for example. Used to be very much the case for Egypt, I believe. Now a little bit less. I think that they just don't care about the Palestinians. They know the dangers inherent in the Palestinian, what they perceive as lack of loyalty.
Mhm.
They saw it when Kuwait was invaded and the Palestinians rejoiced. They saw it when the Abraham Accords was signed and Palestinians demonstrated against the UAE, which has been a source of income for them for decades. They are perceived by those who make the decisions and have the intelligence as not loyal and unreliable. These are very harsh words, but this is the perception. But publicly, declaratively, there is a different rhetoric, and that is because of the public opinion, which is pro-Palestinian.
We should share with our listeners, it's very late at night for Ruth right now, and so she stayed up past her bedtime for this interview. So just a couple other bases, Ruth, and we really appreciate your
Sure.
perspective. I want to talk about the UN Secretary General and his comments, and I don't have a question in particular for you, but if you can just address his comments and where do we go from here with him and the United Nations?
Well, the United Nations was created after the Second World War to protect the rights of people and the rights of security of certain people, particularly the Jewish people who during the Second World War experienced the Holocaust. Ironically, the United Nations, number-wise and country-wise, is extremely and without a doubt pro-Arab. There is an immediate Arab bloc, and that almost immediately equals anti-Israeli. And what has happened with the declaration of the Secretary General was, it was like a stab in the heart of every, I think, single Israeli and every single Jewish person throughout the world.
And if you want to just share what that declaration was for those that might not have heard it.
So he said that one could understand the context in which the Hamas was acting. So I want to ask, in response to that, a question to anybody. What would you do if your daughter was in an undisputed village in your country, sleeping in her bed, 16 years old, and with her, her sister was sleeping in the bed next to her in a kibbutz? And I'm going to be very blunt and unrelenting because I'm describing one of endless scenes that had taken place. And suddenly, a significant number of men burst into the house, started shooting your daughters, raping them one after the other. There were no soldiers. There were no weapons on the Israeli side. These were all civilians performing atrocious, inhumane acts. After the gang rapes, beheadings, mutilation of bodies, issues that are a stain for Islam and for the Palestinians. What would you do Mr. Secretary General, if your daughter went through that, would you say there was a context? Let me explain what the context 2-3 days before was. The IDF was discussing with the political echelon in Israel, allowing more Palestinians from Gaza to have work permits to work in Israel, despite the fact that balloons set fire to agricultural fields of farmers in Israel throughout the last weeks and months and years, despite the fact that the entire south envelope of Israel, undisputed territory, is in post-trauma from endless waves of rocket firing towards civilian populations. The entire country is in shelters. 13 to 15-year-olds wet their beds 20 years because of this post-trauma. This is context. And yet you say that one can somehow understand the context. What exactly do you understand? Gang rapes? To free what? To free Gaza, where not one single IDF soldier was in since 2005? What do you understand in the midst of context? Beheadings? What do you understand by opening the stomach of a pregnant mother? Are we back in the Holocaust? Because these things happen in the Holocaust. The world punished the Germans. They had to pay dearly after the war, dearly. Berlin was divided amongst the Allies. No context was discussed there. Why is context discussed here? And what context exactly, since we had left Gaza since 2005? How does killing hundreds of young people in a peace festival, unarmed, how does that free Palestine? That again, I reiterate, is not free. The Gaza Strip, the West Bank is a different story. But the Gaza Strip has not one IDF soldier since 2005. How on God's earth can one speak of context and justifying and understanding this in the context? And why? Why is Israel to give answers to that there are no infrastructures, no employment opportunities, no proper education, no shopping centers and sustainable sources of income with the billions and billions of dollars which my government naively allowed from Qatar to Hamas? Why Israel is to blame for that and not the actual Hamas leadership, which took all those billions to build an underground city to protect not the civilian population, but its own?
The leadership.
Why?
Yeah, it's the leadership that it's indeed protecting. And speaking of the United Nations, we should say congratulations to the UN ambassador from Israel, Gilad Erdan, for standing up for
Absolutely.
Israel. He has just done just above and beyond and just
Absolutely.
phenomenal work. And he is just such an important voice for the world to hear.
Absolutely.
And he has such a conscience, and he's sharing
I
that.
salute Gilad Erdan. I know him. I feel that he's doing a tremendous, tremendous service for the Jewish people and Israel. And you know what? For the truth.
Mhm.
Because how much can the world not see the truth? How much?
Yeah, I agree. Ruth, as we wind down our conversation right now, I want to ask you about Shimon Peres because you worked for him. And I'm wondering first what he would make of this situation, number one. And number two, just finally, do you have a particular memory or any advice that he ever gave to you that you'd love to share with us?
Okay, so Shimon Peres, I believe, if he would have been alive today, would have been heartbroken because, you know, his dream was the new Middle East and making peace with the Palestinians and the Arab countries. This was his life mission. And it's very difficult these days to walk around Israel's streets because you see the faces of the Israelis. You see, Stephen, you know, it's crazy. The eyes, all of our eyes are hollow. We are in shock from the horror. Not only we didn't expect it, we cannot believe the level of evil. We cannot believe. We did not anticipate that this could happen. We couldn't fathom even the right-wing people that dislike concessions made to the Arabs and the Palestinians. They couldn't even imagine the level of horror that we saw on October 7th. So I think that I think that in a manner of speaking, Shimon Peres would be heartbroken. He would, however, be rejoicing in the face of the Israeli unity and the unity of the Jewish people. And that's a call that I'd like to make, not only to the world to wake up in the face of this evil, but to the Jewish people.
Mhm.
Let's stay united. Let's not fight anymore. Let's not argue anymore. There's no difference between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. And I'm talking about the Jewish people in their entirety, the Jewish peoplehood, including in Israel and in the diaspora. There was too much of a chasm between the diaspora and Israel, too much of a chasm in Israel itself with all of the divisions, too much of, you know how they say that three Jews
Four
have
opinions.
5 opinions or
Yeah.
4 opinions. No more of that.
Or 10
Not
opinions,
because-
Ruth.
Or 10 opinions. No more of that.
Yeah.
Because, and that brings me to something that I believe that Shimon Peres would have said. We have no privilege to be pessimistic. We have no other choice but to make sure that we win. We need to do it in as moral a manner, a value-oriented manner as possible, given the huge challenges. But we cannot do that without our unity, both in Israel and abroad. And this is a huge dream of mine.
Mhm.
And perhaps this is also a sign from God. We cannot allow ourselves to be divided in any way.
And on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Ruth Wasserman Lande, this has been just such a phenomenal conversation. We'd love to have you back. And hopefully during peaceful times, we want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast.
Be'ezrat Hashem and Am Yisrael Chai.
Amen. And we'll have info about Ruth on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And we do release new episodes of the show during our regular schedule every other Wednesday. So mark your calendars. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for IsraelCast. And also do rate and review us because that helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more people around the world to find us and to hear from just truly remarkable and insightful people like Ruth. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And for all the behind the scenes, we want to thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, JD Krebs, and Ellie Cadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us and just say hello, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in. Looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast, and let's all pray for peace.